Charles Harlow had gotten it into his head that he had finally found the golden key. He now knew the reason why he had such poor showings of cotton the last 2 years, even though the oats and sweet potatoes did well as could be expected. And he now knew why last year's visit from the stockman bore no fruit and produced no children, leaving Lizzie without a wet nurse to help pick up the slack when her body refused to produce more milk. He returned from a trip to the mill in Leesburg with an empty dray, 2 pieces of mail with past due postage, and a shiny new book he toted around like the Bible. Affleck's Southern Rural Almanac for 1854, it was called, and it included detailed tables tracking the movement of the planets and the moon for an entire year. At a depot in town, the grisly store owner showed it to him with infectious reverence. The old man flipped through the pages and showed him the drawing of the man of signs, a wavy-haired naked figure surrounded by curlicues and symbols, and bold black lines linking each body part to a zodiac sign. Aries, sign of the ram, corresponded to the man's head, while Pisces, sign of the fishes, corresponded to the man's feet. The store owner went on and on about how a farmer should live by this diagram and its surrounding symbols to know when to sow seeds and cuttings and when to geld, wean, or breed stock. Cancer is the best time for planting, but if you can't manage that, Scorpio and Pisces is second best. And don't geld in any sign above the knees, otherwise the animal will get sick and die, the store owner told him. It wasn't the first time he'd heard sayings of this kind, but before it seemed the superstitions of old drunken men who pontificated daily on the weather with their predictions of rain and high wind, and still never prospered, never owned the land they lived on, or the poor half-starved Negroes they rented for 1 year or another. When he married Lizzie, he learned his father-in-law swore by the e-pact, but when the man tried to explain it in that bored, patronizing way that seemed reserved for Harlow alone, he couldn't grasp it. He understood it on its face, a system of determining the moon's age in January so as to predict the moon's cycle the rest of the year. But the math was hazy, with its accounting of solar days and lunar days. And worse, he didn't understand how it was used, how Lizzie's father organized himself and his labors around it, and how the more questions he posed to the man about it, the more foreign and unknowable the whole thing sounded. It's not like he was out there without a plan of any kind. He had a planting calendar and a weather journal and an assortment of farming methods knocking around in his head. And he had worked enough in various capacities on other farms, from overseer to seasonal hand, to know that no 2 farmers swore by the same method of sowing seed in the ground or getting a healthy yield. Whether one had some special fertilizer he swore by, pig shit or guano, or another only planted onions during the blooming days, most seemed subject to the same luck or ill fortune, each bowing to the whims of the most powerful deity none of their kind could ignore, weather. The difference now was he had seen men savvy enough to sidestep misfortune when it came. At the depot, he'd hear them talking, those who cut the corn early to avoid a sudden freeze, while most everyone else lost their crops and spent the next couple of weeks replanting. The wise, or lucky farmers, said they owed their good fortune to the almanac, to consistent study and testing of its patterns. Only by doing that were they able to predict what the others couldn't. "What about breeding?" Harlow said, turning back to the store owner. "Would the best time be in the sign of Scorpio?" He pointed to the sign directing to the naked man's loins. "Or would any time from the hips to the knees be good?" The store owner didn't know, he said, only that the sign of the Virgin should be avoided. "Is that what happened? You tried to breed them during the time of Virgo?" Harlow didn't know, making a note to check his records against the almanac when he returned home, but another farmer in the store overheard them talking and sorely disagreed. Said the timing of the Virgin was one of generation and blooming, and he should be free to breed or sow seeds in the sign of the Lady with the Flower, as he desired. The 2 men began to argue until a third farmer piped up, saying they were both wrong as a boll weevil, that in times of the Virgo, things were likely to bloom themselves to death, the flowers taking over the plant and stunting all growth. He listened as the men nearly came to blows, each pulling out one story or another as proof, none of which cleared up the matter. He signaled to the store owner to add the new Bible to his bill, and he balanced it among the sundries and few luxuries he picked up whenever he came to town: tea, sugar, real coffee, whiskey, laudanum, and castor oil. With that, he hurriedly left the store. Even though his last attempt had been a bust, it still seemed the best course of action to right the ship, to finally get back in the black. Sure, it wouldn't help him much in the short term, he thought. He'd still likely have to mortgage Alice or Lulu to pay off the promissory note coming due on the land. But some years from now, if he was patient and diligent, he'd surely see a handsome profit. With this in mind, Harlow scheduled the stockman's return for the month that followed, arranging for him to come when the moon was in sign of the scales, which, on the drawing, corresponded to the zodiac man's hips. He'd have the stockman stay until the moon moved lower and lower, until it reached the sign of Capricorn, in the zodiac man's knees. That gave him a good span of auspicious days to work with, 7 consecutive days total, to get it right this time. When Zeke returned, we were so angry with one another we couldn't agree on whether to poison him or conjure him, and whatever tricks we each had in mind for avoiding the deed itself were felled by Mr. Lucy, now lurking nearby, outside the barn or hiding within the dark recesses of it. Half of us spent the week in a dulled blind fury, and the rest in some semblance of a stupor. Junie had stolen some of Mrs. Lucy's laudanum, and the strange liquid had a distancing effect that placed a welcome haze over that entire week. We looked for ways to extend it, asked Nan what sort of herbs we could forage that would do the same thing. To add insult, we spent the days trapped inside. Rain fell for 3 days straight, and we worked in the loom then, the grinding motion of the spinning wheel making a burrowing sound that the walls only made louder. When the 7 days were over and Zeke was carted off to wherever he came from, we still hadn't spoken more than 4 words to one another, and still hadn't by the next time we were scheduled to meet in the woods at the tree. Nearly an hour after the fires dwindled in the Lucy's house, we all made our way there. The fact that we all showed up was surprising, and it was unclear who was coming to fight and who was coming to pray. "Told ya," Patience said, and Junie nearly swung at her. "We knew it was a possibility he'd come back at least once more," Nan said, stepping in between the two. "With all due respect, old woman, if you ain't lain with that bastard," said Patience, "I don't want to hear nothing from you." "Damn right," agreed Lulu. "Shut up," Junie said. "Fine," Nan said. "Kill each other then." She stepped aside and looked at the two women glaring at each other. She dropped the bulky sack of cotton roots on the ground between them. Sarah picked up the sack. "We have to do it again now, as proof that it don't work." "Why in the hell would I do that?" Patience said. "No. If I have one, he'll leave me be for a while." "No. If you have one," said Alice, "he'll bring that water-headed nigger back after every harvest." We were all quiet then, the thought settling over us like a suffocating blanket. The wind rustled the leaves overhead, and a cluster of birds let loose a deafening cry, as if attacked. Nan began to pray, and the rest joined in. It became a teeming hodgepodge of all possibilities, calling forth all helpers and saints, God, the Son, the Holy Ghost, ancestors hymn between realms, in sea, water, and ocean, in sky and above it, those already in the next world and those barreling toward this one, the sun, moon, and stars, haints, both walking and stationary, those residing in birds and those residing in trees, and the gods of our parents, whose true holy names we were never told. Every tradition, now mixed together, binding evil with the blade of grass, burying hair and skin of the stockman in a makeshift grave of clay and dirt and snakeskin, tarrying under moon until we grew dizzy, finally ending in a frenzied ring shout turned dirge. By the end, we were all soaked, wet as if we'd been dunked into the creek's heavy gray water, but lighter. We had shaken something loose, moved it out of the way, and could now touch the edge. Sarah reached for the sack and passed out the woody, dank roots to each of us. A holy sacrament now. We each took one and chewed it. By the time we were done making candles and soap, and the cold weather of winter began to break, there had only been one slippage, which we caught before it got too far along. Alice miscarried, and we sent the soul back over, saving it for a better time, a better place, though we knew it might not take kindly to what we had done. Harlow then brought Dr. Lewis in to look us over, a young pale man with barely a hair on his chin and a leather bag of loose jangly tools. Back to the barn we were sent, where he examined us one by one. And for those who had spent any time in the back rooms of auction houses, this was little different. He thumped breasts and hips, made us lie face down on a short makeshift table, with our shoulders and head hanging off the end. One could look down at the dusty ground, littered with strands of hay, while a cold metal spoon was forced between her thighs. The dim room grew darker, and one by one, we felt ourselves lowered into the belly of that big whale of Jonah's. But Jonah himself, no account bastard, was nowhere to be found. The doctor rummaged around, poking and scraping, until finally he removed the spoon, stepping back and declaring himself done. Outside, he and Harlow spoke, but their words made no sense now, a new language they found between them. The doctor said we seemed sound, and he was unsure why there seemed to be such trouble with this matter. They talked more out of earshot, but a few words floated down toward us. Feckless, the doctor called us. Liable to eat their own. We didn't know who Dr. Lewis declared barren until a few weeks later, when Mr. Lucy took Alice along to help with a mill run and came back without her. Chapter 7. Seasons stack on top of one another, and time rolls by as if a single year, and not two, sandwiched together. We mark the seasons not by temperature so much as by task. Corn goes in before sweet potatoes go in before cotton. We rotate planting of the second half of crops with cowpeas or snap beans or oats. We mourn Alice as if she's passed on. We take a few of her things to the tree, her comb, a pair of woolen stockings, a brass button, and leave them there, so she's with us every time we go crossing. Without her, we feel strange and unmoored. The feeling doesn't pass. There's too much rain, there's not enough rain. We weed and scrape and weed, lay some of the corn by and plant again. That is, until yellow fever comes and lays us low in the summer of 1856, taking both Silas and Miss Lizzie's youngest, William. Out of fear of contagion, the two children were buried together far in the woods, much to both mothers' chagrin. Patience didn't want her child buried anywhere near William, though in life the two were often tethered. Patience hoped for Silas to be free of the Lucys in death. Lizzie loudly made it known that she didn't want young William buried far away in the woods. She told anyone who would listen she wanted him buried close to the house, where she could visit him often, and his father would have to bypass that whitewashed cross every day. Another reminder of the folly he had brought upon her and her offspring since he'd brought them to this God-forsaken place. Still weak with fever, Patience prepared Silas for burial, refusing all help from the rest of the women. She knew this hurt Nan the most, as she spent more time with him than any of them, but Patience couldn't help it. "You already got all the time with him," she told Nan. The old woman's face crumpled, but Patience pretended she didn't see it. She turned her back and waited for the woman to walk away before she approached the boy's stilled, wrinkled body. Alone, she washed him, rubbed the small calluses on his feet with oil, cut his hair with a straight razor. The disease had made him tiny again. She dressed him in white, in a shroud Junie and Sarah had made, with small crosses and cosmograms stitched around the hem. She made a pocket in the shroud and sewed her new rosary inside it. This one she had made herself, with dried seeds and twine, and so it seemed the most fitting to accompany him. She washed his face once more, and then pulled him into her arms for the last time. He was so light it stunned her. It felt like gathering the air. The burial was quick, the words too few, and even the few things they said made no sense to her. The Father taketh and giveth. Her boy would be welcomed in heaven as he was not welcomed on earth. The words gave her no comfort. On the way back, she broke reeds and branches, trying to leave markers so she could find her way back there. She promised herself when there was an ounce more of strength in her body, she would gather the women and they would come back here and move her son. They would bury him elsewhere. There was more rain, more fever, and even a frightful battle with locusts in the spring of 1857. Nan kept a tally stick where she marked the occasions, but the rest of us couldn't read it, and whenever we asked, she'd warn us that the 2 times the stockman came were different. Once before cotton-picking time, and once a ways after, and so if we were looking to the season for clues of an impending third visit, we may not find it there. Mrs. Lucy gave birth for the 4th time, a baby girl they named Carol, a healthy miracle child arriving on a wave of pestilence, a sure symbol of forthcoming bounty, the Lucys exclaimed. New neighbors sprouted up to the west and again to the south. Most were small homesteads like ours, but a huge one across the water's edge loomed large like a small city, with rows of small buildings dotting the horizon. We could sometimes hear their cow horn in the morning, or a jangle of different bells summoning folks for one thing or another, all throughout the day. The Lucys were at odds. She ecstatic, him annoyed. Excited by the prospect of friends again, Mrs. Lucy met all the wives, invited the women in their hands over for quiltings, and took us over to their places for corn huskings and sheep shearing parties. Mr. Lucy, however, saw every neighbor as an affront, a wily bastard who stole swaths of land out from under him, land he'd been just on the verge of acquiring the second his fortune turned around. We no longer asked Nan about the marks on her tally stick. Someone begged her, she wouldn't say who, to cover over any nicks marking the stockman's visits. Now, whenever she's asked to recount the days for us, from the strange freeze that rotted the bowls, or that time a hailstorm punched new holes in the roof, the awful fact of Zeke is left out. It was true we loved these new gatherings with these new neighbors. A corn husking was all right, but a frolic deep in the woods was even better. A quilting was pleasant, but a church meeting under night sky, packed together in a rickety dark praise house, not much bigger than an outhouse, made us all giddy and lightheaded. Some of us loved any excuse to be in the company of these others, and we loved them most simply because they weren't us. They offered up news from the world, stories and songs we hadn't heard, dances we didn't know. A lot of them were from Virginia or Maryland, others from Alabama or the Carolinas or Indian country, and others still were just a foot out of Africa, smuggled into Texas illegally by way of Cuba. They spoke various tongues and creoles, unfamiliar and musical, with different country marks adorning their faces and chests, not to mention different sects of Christians with newfangled crosses and rosaries. Others were Muslims who carried white prayer shawls wherever they went and dropped to their knees 5 times a day. But we were most excited by the spiritual professionals, 2 bona fide conjurers, each making mojos and protective pouches for any who could pay, and one preaching mystic who said the Bible had been written on his heart, so we should hold him in higher esteem than any of the traveling missionaries who rolled through the area once a season to bring us the gospel. This new community was full of quirks and beliefs that felt foreign and strange. We hadn't met them all and probably never would, and while some of us embraced that as means to enjoy these folks with a certain temporary abandon, others put up all efforts to remain at a cool, shelf-like reserve. Chapter 8. Before Sarah met Noah, she didn't believe in following her impulses. She thought herself an expert at dulling any ragged urge that felt costly. So much so, by the time Noah became a secret she kept from the other women, she barely recognized herself. How quickly she became a wet ball of desires, wanting and dreaming all the time. The nakedness of it made her ashamed, but that didn't stop her from willing daylight to speed by, from stepping gingerly over Patience's sleeping body and out of the cabin to go and meet him. She first met him at one of those Saturday night frolics deep in the woods, but she had seen him before then, in passing, patching the road with the other men or bringing in kindling when the women were quilting over on his farm. And from the beginning, he struck up a strange compulsion in her, one she found herself warring with. For some reason, her eye was drawn to him whenever he worked or moved about. Even when she forced herself not to look in his direction, she was still aware of him, could still feel his presence somehow a few feet away. The whole thing struck her as dangerous for a reason she couldn't identify. Her senses kept track of the Lucys in a similar fashion, almost always making note of their line of sight, their physical proximity, a quick cataloging of their gaits and faces for temperature and mood. She felt a similar cataloging happening, but with a different edge entirely. She noticed it at the last quilting. He came in with a stack of wood and greeted all the women. He then set the wood down in the corner and attended to the dying fire in the chimney. One woman teased him about joining the group, said he boasted to her earlier that he could sew better than her, and that he should prove it. All the women laughed, and he smiled with a generous show of pretty teeth, revealing a man-made dimple above his right cheek, triangular like the tip of a sharp blade. He shook his head but soon succumbed to the good-natured joshing of the women. He took the rag and needle the woman closest to him offered and sat down at the edge of the group. He sewed a few stitches while the women peered over his handiwork, commenting all the while. "Not bad," said one woman. "But not better than me," said the original challenger. They all laughed, and his eyes swept over the group, catching Sarah's for a second. She froze, mid-laugh, her mouth still open, feeling caught somehow. But just like that, his sweep was over. He handed back over the rag and needle and stood up. He waved goodbye to them all and quickly left. And she tried to listen to the gossip that followed, how 2 women commented on how handsome he was, and a third got angry at the 2 for noticing. She wondered then if the curious feeling he inspired was not hers alone, but something he stirred up wherever he went. In the weeks between sightings, Sarah tried to forget the curious feeling, and by the time word arrived that some of the new people were throwing another frolic that Saturday, she had almost convinced herself that it was just a delusion now past. She was determined to go, although she heard it was becoming more and more dangerous. There were whispers of rollicking patrols shutting down parties and busting up prayer meetings. Near the property line, she swore she could hear the patrollers some nights. Eerie echoes of high-pitched laughter and drunken singing, punctuated by the steady clopping of horses. So successful were the patrol's outings that there was little chatter or vague invitations to any frolics at all the last couple of weeks, and she had been warned that this one would be harder to get to, more far-flung, and deeper in the woods than all the others before. Only Sarah and Patience were willing to risk it, and so the 2 stepped out alone, late that night. The moon was bright, but the walk was long, and the mosquitoes so vicious they almost turned back, only heartening when they heard the soft strains of a fiddle. The 2 headed on until they reached a small clearing, where the frolic was already in progress. The fiddle player stood at one end, an excited caller goading the crowd, calling out dances to a group of women, dressed in a brilliant array of color, their skirts and dresses dyed berry red, mustard yellow, or deep indigo. Some of them wore hoop skirts, set with twine and starch, so stiff they crackled. Bracelets of copper and wood jangled from their arms. Their hair was plaited and curled or tied up in colorful scarves. The smell of flowers rose up from them, ribbons of honeysuckle and gardenia dangling from their necks. On the opposite edge, men gambled, a solemn throwing of misshapen dice, made of bone, dotted with gray-black tips. Cheers went up as the dice stopped rolling. Under moonlight, it was easy to mistake one side for another. 3 marks for 2, 5 for 3, and the men squinted and shouted and cussed. "He cheatin'. Don't give him the dice no more." Some men threw up their hands and went to dance with the women. 2 women were racing now, but the most easy-gaited thing you ever did see. They balanced cups of water on their heads and danced toward the edge, arms and legs light and delicate. Whoever spills the water first loses. Whoever gets to the edge without spilling the water wins. On another side, men and women were telling lies and drinking, filling gourds and tin cups with a strong-smelling brew. Within seconds, Patience dashed off toward the barrel, returning to Sarah with a cup full of the strong, heady liquid. Sarah took a few sips and coughed as the liquid burned her chest. A breeze overhead picked up the leaves and moved through them in a slow, languid wave. Patience drank the rest and dragged Sarah out into the crowd by the elbow. Sarah saw Noah then, crouched at the edge of the dice game, smoking a cob pipe and making bets. She mimicked Patience's hands and hip motions, but her eyes kept on drifting back to the game. It appeared to be his turn now. He took the dice, shook them in one hand and then the other, blew on them, kissed them up and tossed them gently. The men shouted as the dice stopped, some cheering, some cursing, and he rolled again, and then a third time, until the streak was over. He stepped back from the circle, where a woman in yellow threw a long, possessive arm around his neck. Sarah turned away, back toward Patience, whose face was softer than it had been in months. The music sped up, a triangle now joining the fiddle, and the 2 women laughed and spun. Sarah threw her head back and caught a glimpse of the night sky, starry and bright, an almost full moon hanging above them. A balmy breeze blew across her face, and she stared at that moon. Almost full to bursting. That's how she felt. A whole moon somewhere inside her had pieced itself together, and now it was nearly whole again, this weird, airy fullness in her chest. A strange joy tinged with hurt. The 2 women whirled through the air, spinning and dancing, the 2 laughing into each other's ears, each other's chest. They stumbled out of the circle of dancing to the edge, where they collapsed onto the grass. The fiddle slowed down, and the dancers partnered up, shifting from quick step to slow drag. Couples danced close, their bodies pressed up against each other, and she spotted him there in the crowd, dancing with the woman in yellow. Patience headed to the barrels for another drink, while Sarah sat still, the party whirring around her, the moon lower now. So large it seemed close, as if it were slowly lowering itself down to meet her. If she just waited patiently, maybe she could touch it. "Come on down," Sarah hollered toward it. She laughed, clapping her hands over her mouth. "Come on down," she heard a voice echo. She turned to see Noah grinning at her. "That didn't work. Should we try again?" he asked. Sarah nodded and he dropped down next to her in the grass. "Come on down," they hollered in unison before breaking into laughter. "Shut up that noise," an older man behind them yelled. "Have the patrollers running through here any minute now with all that foolishness." They murmured a series of sheepish apologies while trying to stifle their laughter. But the more they tried to contain it, the stronger it became, until they were both tired and out of breath. They sat there for a moment, just breathing, before he finally turned to her again. "If you got it to come down, what'd you do with it?" "I don't know. You just don't want to say," he said. "It's silly," she said. "You'll think I'm touched." "I won't." She raised her eyebrows at him. "I swear," he said. "I think I'd grab hold of it and follow it till I get back home. It goes everywhere. Why wouldn't it pass through there?" He grinned. "You think it's dumb?" she asked. "No, the opposite. Wondering why I never thought of it." They both laughed. "Especially since they used to say Pawpaw flew home. I wonder if that's how he did it," he said. "But how would you hold on? Wouldn't you just fall off it once it went up again?" "Maybe, but hopefully I'd be closer than I am now," she said. "Would you have to go under first?" "Under? Under where?" He grabbed a stick and began drawing a shape in the grass. He drew a circle with a cross inside it. He pointed at the median line separating the top and bottom half. Above, land, sky, us, and below, water, land of the dead. He pointed to the very top of the circle. "The sun," she said. He pointed to the bottom. She said, "The moon?" He nodded. "The farthest point in the land of the dead, where the oldest ancestors live." "I'd have to go there? Through the entire land of the dead and come back round? Oh, hell no." They both laughed. "You afraid?" he asked. "Hell yeah," she said. "And if you're not, you should be. Would you do it?" "No, not until it's my time. But death don't scare me." "Really?" "No. You don't have to play tough." "I'm not. The pain is scary, but if you just go into the other side for a while," he pointed to the bottom of the circle again, "where everybody is, and then you make your way back over, it's not that scary. You could wind up somewhere better than you were before." "Do you know if your people made it there, like your pawpaw?" she said as she pointed to the bottom half of the circle. He shrugged. "I don't know. He doesn't visit. Seems like he'd visit if he made it over. Back home, I used to try to see my mother. I'd go into the creek and hold my breath for as long as I could, hoping she'd come back to get me. But she never came." "Could you see anything?" "No, not really," she said. "Most of the time I was too scared. There was all kind of slimy things in the water. That's what made me stop trying. Water snakes." He laughed. "And not the tiny ones, but the really big ones." She opened her arms wide. They were both quiet for a moment, the party still whirring around them. The woman in yellow was waving now. Sarah pretended she couldn't see the woman from the corner of her eye. "You think the moon gets lonely up there?" he asked. "Sure, everybody gets lonely. The sun ain't in hollering distance, but the stars are right there." "The stars probably awful company," she said. "All that haughty twinkling. Wouldn't that get on your nerves?" "Okay, what about the clouds? They may be better. But they so sometimey, in and out with the wind or smothering everything." They laughed again. "What's so funny? I want to laugh too," Patience said, plopping down next to them. "It's not going to last much longer." They both turned toward her. "The drink. I had to scramble for this little bit," she said, holding her tin cup triumphantly. "You want?" She offered the cup to Sarah before turning to the man. "Who you?" "Noah, from Carolina," he said. "Huh. Mr. Noah, if a raft was going by with 3 women on it," began Patience, "one wearing red, one wearing yellow, and one wearing brown, which would you save?" "Huh?" said Noah. "Okay, would you save the tall one, the short one, or the midways one?" Patience asked. He looked at Sarah. "What's she talking about?" Sarah shrugged. "Mr. Noah, get on out of here. You ain't serious." He stared at the 2 women, unsure if Patience was joking or not. "Go on," Patience said, waving him away. "Fine. A fellow knows when he ain't wanted," he said, standing up in mock disappointment. He winked at Sarah as he backed away into the sea of dancers. "Good. Then you a better man than most," Patience hollered after him. She turned to Sarah, now watching Noah talking to the woman in yellow. Patience let out a low chuckle. "Oh, not you too." "What? A goner for any fool come grinning in your face?" "We was just talking," Sarah said, taking the cup from Patience. "Besides, that girl in yellow's probably his sweetheart." "No, he was just talking. You were doing something else," Patience said, smoothing her skirt and giving Sarah an exaggerated flirty grin. What you mean? I don't do that. Patience laughed, and didn't seem like he asked any of the questions he would have if he wasn't trying to court you proper. Did he even ask if you were unattached? No. No questions about spun or woven cloth, or boats rigged or not? No. Should he have? Bird, did he even ask if he could talk to you before he sat down here? No. Well, then. As Patience talked, Sarah continued watching Noah and the woman in yellow. They were dancing now. He was trying to make her laugh, and the woman was trying hard not to be amused, trying hard to stay upset, but even Sarah could see the woman was softening toward him. Sarah wondered what was between the two, if they were, in fact, attached somehow. And while she hadn't considered the conversation between them as anything more than frivolous banter, to have it confirmed as such spawned a growing twinge of disappointment inside her. She stood up and stretched her hand out to Patience. We should go. Patrollers be through here soon. Patience took her hand and stood up. The two women drifted away from dancers and the music, slipping back through the woods, where the moon shone bright and full, with nary a cloud in sight. Chapter 9. Harlow's right hand itched. New calluses forming on top of the old ones, causing the tough white skin to flake and peel. The culprit was likely the handle of his new plow. He had been out there behind it since sunup, lumbering after the two plodding horses, while the women weeded and hilled the cotton for the last time. Any day now, the bolls would start to open, and the frenzy of picking would begin. He rubbed his hands together. In the lore of old wives' tales, itchy palms meant money was coming. Hopefully, there was a grain of truth in that. He had already lost a quarter of the cotton crops to worms, so he needed the rest of it to yield proper. He'd bought the new plow on credit, along with sulfur, vinegar, quinine, saltpeter, rope, and ink, and would need a decent profit to finally get square with all the merchants he owed. Merchants who regularly showed him statements listing out his purchases and the total amounts due. Daunting sums that seemed to tick up and up every time he closed his eyes. He walked to the house but didn't go in. He was stalling. He should go inside and eat something, and then hurry back out for another round with the plow. He left Junie with it, but he didn't trust her on her own for long. She leaned when she got tired, skimming too close to the crop. But his stomach was jumpy and he couldn't imagine food would make it any better. Once Ollie showed up, he'd be able to eat. Hours ago, he had sent his now 11-year-old son over to Levi Sutton's house with a note, suggesting the two men revisit an old conversation they once had about Sutton's interest in purchasing a swath of Harlow's land. From the second the boy left, Harlow hadn't been able to focus. Ollie should be back by now, he thought, but he had told the boy to wait for an answer, and maybe Sutton wasn't there when he arrived. Or maybe it was a stalling tactic on Sutton's part, he wondered, and somehow he had already ceded his hand. Perhaps he should have waited until Sutton sent a response. Then he could have been the one delaying. He could have waited a whole day before responding, as if he, too, were so unconcerned by the prospect of buying or selling a measly 50 acres. He didn't care for his neighbor Levi Sutton much. The man was all airs and bluster, snatching up acreage for miles and miles. It was as if the man was over there building his own town. Beyond the acres and acres of cotton, corn, and millet, there was a big, fancy white house, not to mention a maze with an actual orchard of all kinds of fruit trees and decorative rose bushes. Folks didn't even refer to it as Sutton's place, but instead, some haughty moniker like Greenbrier or Greenwich. He hated to sell any land to Sutton, hated what it might mean if Sutton had designs on more than just that one strip of land. But he tried not to think that far. Instead, he set his mind on paying down his creditors, on getting his financial affairs out of the red. He sat on the porch, watching the horizon, waiting for the dust clouds of Ollie's horse to appear. And yes, he knew what was said about watched pots and all, but in his line of work, he watched pots all the time. There was little he didn't put his eyes on and wait for verification that it would do what it was supposed to. Grow, yield, seed, sunder. Where was that boy? Just as likely to have dawdled off the path if he saw the slightest inkling of something interesting. The boy wasn't worth a gill of hard work, and if the farm didn't turn around soon, he wouldn't be able to set Ollie up with much of anything when the boy came of age in a few years. The sun shifted from behind the clouds, its angry rays now beaming down on his head and neck. From where he sat, he could hear baby Carol wailing inside. When she was first born, about a year after they buried young William, he and Lizzie thought her a miracle child, but no one used that language to describe Carol anymore. The baby had come into the world with Lizzie's orneriness, a fussy, angry ball of constant caterwauling. He pushed the front door to the house open. "Will someone shut that child up?" No one replied, but it didn't matter, for at that second, the baby went quiet. He stepped into the dim, hot room, smoke lingering in the air, the hearth fire burning. Dorcas, the new wet nurse, cradled the baby in her lap while Lizzie hovered over them. He could see, now that his eyes had adjusted, that the child had stopped screaming because her mouth was full, impaled by the woman's dark, naked breast. The wet nurse had been with them nearly a week, and still, the whole business seemed indecent to him. A stranger, some other man's property, nursing his daughter. A trace of shame flickered inside him. His gaze met Lizzie's. She narrowed her eyes at him. Not now. He walked over to them, where Dorcas lifted her head in his direction without lifting her eyes. See, the fact that she didn't even have the decency to cover herself in a white man's presence said everything. He reached for the baby. "Give her here," Harlow said. She not done yet, Dorcas said, pulling a cloth up over herself and the suckling child. That ain't no business of yours. Give her here. Lizzie will feed her, he said, grabbing hold of Carol's foot. The hell I will, said Lizzie, stepping in between them, pushing Harlow backward. Ignore him, Dorcas. Let her have as much as she wants. Lizzie steered him away from the wet nurse over to the opposite side of the room. I've said all I've going to say about this. I got her with my own money. It was true. Lizzie had done the unthinkable. After the last bout of breastfeeding, she declared herself done with it. No more arduous attempts at latching, at increasing milk supply with herbs and poultices, or nursing despite raw sore nipples and clogged ducts. No matter what she did, she could never produce enough milk for their children. The babies howled day and night, and here she was, having to rely on animal milk and pap, like a serf, since the women in the quarters had yet to bear fruit. This is what she spat at him whenever he brought up the matter. This time, though, she had secured a wet nurse herself. She rented a woman with fresh milk from an acquaintance in the next county over and paid for her services 6 months outright, without even consulting him about it. The wet nurse just showed up one day. He came back from the fields, and Lizzie was sitting there with her in the front room as if nothing extraordinary was going on. The couple fought about it for hours that first night, to the point of exhaustion, with him refusing to allow the wet nurse near the baby until finally the child's incessant screaming wore him down. Even now, so many days later, he was still sore about it. Is it my money that's feeding her? Is she laying up under the roof that I built? Fine, I'll pay for that too. How much you want for her room and board? Said Lizzie. That's not the point. Then what is the point? He slumped down at the table. He started to say something but stopped. He was tired of explaining himself, tired of her insinuating that the mountain of debt was all his fault, as if he were a god that could control weather and pestilence, as if he could simply raise his hand and stop rain and drought, or wave away the presence of worms, weevils, or grackles. It was simply a precarious business. Had been since the Panic of 1837 and the Great Depression that followed it. It made paupers of men smarter than him, and she didn't seem to appreciate how close they had come, that it was he who kept the wind at their backs, he who had secured the 500 acres that they lived upon, even after Alice's buyer sued him for failure to disclose her barrenness. He handled it, hadn't he? Mounted an appeal that got the refund amount cut in half. Sure, he had to mortgage Lulu and Sarah to secure a loan to pay the damages and the exorbitant legal fees, but he took care of it. He retained the title to the land, and that was the most important thing. Without that, where would they be? Maybe her father was the reason she didn't seem to appreciate any of it. The reason she thought she understood more about the workings of his business than he did. The reason why every so often she butted into farm affairs, giving her opinion when he hadn't asked for it. And worse, refusing to allow him to use her property as collateral. He suspected her father was advising her, and worse, sending her money that she wasn't telling him about. But he had no proof, and she wouldn't admit it. The point is, he began, you brought a plumb stranger into this house without my say-so. I apologize for that already. It's not like I bought her. I thought you'd be pleased to have peace in the house again. And look, Carol's so happy. I think she's already gained a pound or two. He sighed. Nan burst in, heaving a big steaming pot of soup onto the table. Soup, in this heat. If that wasn't proof Lizzie's judgment couldn't be trusted, then what was? I don't want to see no more soup on this table until I can see my breath out there. You hear me? He said to Lizzie. But his wife wasn't listening. She had drifted back over to the baby and was now busy cooing at the suckling child. Lizzie! You hear me? Chapter 10. What Sarah had wanted, but didn't know she wanted, came just before Christmas. The air was cooling, and the drop in temperature gave the last few frolics of the year new urgency. She felt it most when the fiddler traded off with Delilah, a statuesque woman with a haunted singing voice. She sang beautifully, but no matter the song chosen or the tempo, it all became a dirge. Call it moon sickness, the way Delilah could stir things up in everyone. A slow unraveling of whatever dark mass was swirling deep down inside. A catharsis of the worst kind emerged, as there were never more fights than when Delilah sang, never more old couplings discarded and new ones made. And yet no one could keep her from singing, really. Someone always asked her to, always pushed her toward the front and begged for a song, paying her in peaches or shiny apples. It was during this season of Delilah and her ongoing dirges that their conversations picked up again. Noah would see her at one of these outings and sit down next to her as if they were old friends, and he'd ask her about the social life of the moon and stars, as if he were inquiring about the health and well-being of distant kin. Sarah looked forward to these exchanges, no matter how brief they were, no matter how silly they seemed to Patience or anyone else. And over time, a strange web of language emerged underneath, like it was possible to talk about nearly anything under the veil of the moon's mercurial nature or the sun's ruthless glare. If it had been a particularly rotten set of days, she might answer his question by talking about the dead moon and how dark everything seemed without it. I wouldn't blame it if it didn't come back at all. These discussions made her even more curious about the women he danced with, the possessive one in yellow whose name she since learned was Clara, and others too. And until the night he taught her to whistle, she began to think he never would dance with her. Maybe she wasn't a woman he could dance with. Maybe she wasn't the sort to be courted or sweethearted. That night, she had been telling him about how Nan only pulls a plant out of the ground based on what the moon says. If the right face ain't up there, she lets it be. He responded with a long, low whistle. The sun must be jealous as a clam. Do it again. That sound. He whistled again, now adding another note to it, going one octave lower in the key of one of Delilah's dirges. For a moment, it snapped her home somehow, back to standing at the reef beside her twin brother, with him whistling at the fish in hopes of drawing them toward the net. I never could do that, she said. Sure you can. He showed her how to hold her mouth, how to relax her face, but she couldn't get any sound to come out. Watch me, he told her. The permission to look at him up close felt unsettling, so different from the faraway glances she stole most times. The thick eyebrows and smooth skin, the dimple-like scar on his cheek. Give me your hand, he said. She allowed him to put her fingers close to his mouth so she could feel the shape he was making. See? Not so forced. Easy. She could feel his breath on her fingers, the warm grip of his hand holding hers, and a strange sensation flooded her body. She stilled herself, trying to follow it, this unfamiliar feeling. He felt her stiffen and dropped her hand, turned his face away from hers, toward a clattering sound, where Delilah stood, readying her song again. The strange sensation subsided. A cloud swept in, blocking the moon. She blew out a spurt of air, then another, without any hint of a whistle at all. Show me again. He grinned. He whistled a few notes toward her, the same song as before. No, she said. Show me again. She touched his hand. And there was that feeling again, a strange tingling wave that spread from her fingers all the way up to her shoulders as he guided her hand to his lips. For the first time, she met his gaze directly. After that, he didn't leave her side the rest of the evening. Even when Clara came by, he didn't waver, only introduced the two women in an easy manner and went back to teaching Sarah the different notes she could make, depending on the shape she made with her tongue. From then on, Sarah saw Noah regularly, if not weekly, then nearly every other. If there wasn't a frolic or a prayer meeting, he came over on passes, with a husband going to see his wife on another neighboring farm. Noah never came to Sarah's directly, because the Lucys had denied every request from neighboring men wanting to visit, said they didn't want strange niggers on their property, as who only knew what those men might be capable of, a stance Mr. Lucy would feel vindicated in after the Manigault murder some months later. The two often met at the creek on those Saturday nights. She'd slip off not long after the evening meal, groaning about how Nan needed her help with some arduous task. She'd then creep to the loom, where she could see the bank of trees just above the creek, and wait for Noah's tall, lean figure to appear. Over time, she told him things she had never told the women, things that only multiplied in the gaps between seeing each other when weather or circumstance doubled or tripled the periods between visits, and it wasn't long before their meetings took on a certain ritualized order. Often, the confessions were first. Not necessarily weighty things, just the things each had been holding in to tell the other, only touching after they had talked themselves out. When she tried to parse out the particular magic of it, it got even harder to pin down. She couldn't explain why he felt safe, why from the moment he sat down next to her, talking as if they were lifelong friends, she never felt the impulse to run away, why with him she remained more curious than afraid. And she never expected to like the sex. She figured it was something that might happen, because it was a thing that happened, regardless of how she felt about it. She assumed at some point its likeliness after realizing what a glutton she was for being touched by him. What was most surprising to her about the act was that it didn't come over her like the weight of the ocean, didn't pass through her like the bow of a steamship. That when it happened, it seemed like the horizon line meeting the earth, the most natural adhering of two things always coming back together. Whereas all sex before felt like a splintering, what she felt with him was the opposite, a deep and sweet mending. Her body became a map of all the places he had touched, and what lingered afterward in the soft soreness of her muscles seemed to her like a delicious telepathy between them in the silence that followed. We were kind and held our tongues, and often pretended to be asleep when she crept back in after a visit. We didn't poke holes at her secret, and weren't surprised when she couldn't keep it to herself, when she let it slip from her mouth in that dazed way of beloveds, what he had said last time they had seen each other, how he could make an instrument out of anything, how he had given her a ring, a razor-thin band fashioned from a button. It reminded us how young she was, how that first rush of love could take you like a strong tide. And who were we to deny her that fleeting joy? We knew some women went their whole lives and never tasted it, or had it for what felt like seconds, as searing and haunting as a dream, before it left them, and they convinced themselves that they had never known it at all, because that loss, stacked among the others, seemed the easiest to deny. Because even if you found it, how long before a white man raised his hand and put a body of water in between? And maybe this was the small hiccup in our generosity. It won't last, we said. Young people hearts fickle as the moon. You know how many sweethearts I had way back when. Could count mine on both hands. What we were really saying, though, is don't get attached to anybody, if you can help it. If it ain't your kindred, ain't your blood, don't carry anybody's heart into your belly. Men are weak, ever hungry, flighty. Some nights, we'd laugh and tell her stories about men we had taken up with, men who courted us slow and heavy as molasses, only to find out later they had wives and children on a neighboring farm. We'd warn her about the temperature of a man's heart, how quickly it could turn to frost, the same way a northeaster could surprise the plants and freeze them quick. Sarah would just laugh and shake her head, the folly of old bitter women, she must have thought. If she had been willing to listen, she might have heard the steady murmur of something else, the haunting of the disappeared, the husband swallowed up by sea or sky without warning. Sky took him, water took him, earth took him. Easier than saying he was beaten to death after running away, or his master died and he was given to an uncle in another state. Facts weren't friends. They could be fickle as paint, hard to come by, and easily changed. But we didn't blame her for wanting. We crossed our fingers, made offerings to the saints on her behalf in hopes they would let her have this one thing she desperately wanted. All week long, she waited to see him, and if he had been sent off on a cattle job, it could mean 2 or 3. And so, when the occasion demanded, we braided her hair special, helped her dye a skirt red or indigo, and made her perfume necklaces of flowers stolen from Miss Lizzie's garden, in hopes she could enjoy this bright thing, unsullied, for as long as it lasted. Chapter 11. Dorcas had lost track of just how many days she had been with the Harlows, and how long it would be until she could return home. Her sleep was leaden and thick, and every morning, when she was yanked from it, either by the infant's high-pitched wailing or the angry shadow of its mother shoving the child toward her face, she spent the first few minutes lost and disoriented. She slept on the floor next to the manger, as she was supposed to anticipate the child's waking, to hear it grunting or squirming before it began wailing, but she never did. The briny blackness of wherever she had gone in her sleep never gave up its hold so easily. She could still feel that heaviness upon her when she took baby Carol into her arms and the child burrowed its face onto her breast. She'd lift her blouse and the infant would latch on, the how, who, where, and why seeping back into her brain. Carol was solely her charge, from the moment the infant woke up until the second it went to sleep. The child was to be within arm's length of her at all times, and what was worse, the child seemed to know it. The first few days, the hungry infant clung to her with a fierceness that she thought would dissipate in the days that followed, but it never did. It was as if the child decided the key to ending its deprivation was to fix itself to Dorcas permanently. Even once fed, Carol would not allow herself to be put down. If she woke up from sleep and found herself in the manger, she howled until she saw Dorcas was near, until the woman picked her up and held her. This was disturbing enough, but what Dorcas found even more troubling was the child's ravenous appetite. How it only grew and grew, the babe fattening and lengthening with swollen cheeks and wide, watchful eyes. Not to mention the growing strength of the child, how it held up its neck to peer around or spread its fingers to grasp at her collarbone, how its small pink mouth began to pull more and more milk from her with graceless ease. As the milk seeped out of Dorcas, she felt something go with it, something she couldn't name. She didn't fight the child, not consciously, but some part of her body tensed up, trying to hold something back. But the more she held back, the more the child seemed to want. She felt other things seeping out of her now, her memories and self-made things. A river flowed out of her. She couldn't explain what was floating out on that river, what was leaving her that she could no longer retrieve, or the gray widening blur it left in its wake. Not that there was anyone to explain it to. No one spoke to her, not really. As long as Carol was in her arms, there was no need. Even Nan, the peevish cook, who came and went and tidied, who set down food and water for her sometimes, always seemed to be looking past her, always seemed to regard her with exasperation. Dorcas had an inkling of why that might be. It was because she refused to take up any task that had nothing to do with the child. If the child was sleeping, she stood by and waited for it to wake up. She would not rinse a cup or a dish or scrub the child's laundry. If that seemed wrong to the cook, she did not care. The house regarded her as a 2-legged heifer, and so she would do no more than wait to be milked. That is what they rented her for. They would get nothing more. She said as much the first day, and had barely said a word to anyone since. But the truth was, they took more from her all the time. The child was a thief, and it stole more from her every passing day. She felt weaker, the child heavy and fat in her arms, weighing her down in the chair. Her vision grew soft, and all sounds seemed to be coming through a long, winding tunnel. She'd think, next time I go down to the privy and relieve myself, I won't return. But once she was outside, the weakness always flared up. She couldn't tell one fuzzy tree from another, if she should follow the sun or go in the opposite direction. The one time she wandered way past the privy, the peevish cook spotted her near the loom and assumed she got turned around. "Lost, huh?" Nan said. "Follow me. I'll take you back." The woman began leading her toward the house. "Don't take me back there," Dorcas wanted to say, but she held her tongue. She didn't know Nan, didn't know what thoughts the woman could be trusted with. The truth was, only her left eye was any good to begin with. The right eye had a cloud in it, ever since she was a child. The left eye compensated and did all the work, so it sometimes grew tired. But never this tired. It never gave up altogether. The way it seemed to now in this house, with this child at her breast. If she didn't give the child any more milk, or rationed it somehow, would some of her sight return on its own accord? Were all her memories and things now buried in the pale, jiggly flesh of this squirming baby? What could she break the flesh with? What could she use to pierce the fat thigh or moon-like belly? Maybe the loss of vision was a blessing, and she was being spared from seeing anything more. On particularly hazy days, the soft blur of her vision turned the child into a faint, affable presence. The sucking sound became a lapping body of water, and a pleasant warmth washed over her. She felt far away then, on the other side of that long tunnel, from where she could see the Harlows milling about, just pale streaks on a distant stage. Other times, the whole house seemed monstrous to her. A faceless changeling fixed itself to her day and night. Her nose was assaulted by a heady mix of curdled milk and soiled diapers. The warping floor planks creaked underneath her feet, and the room was full of ghosts and swirling smoke, while outside, swarms of iridescent blackbirds veered and circled the house, cawing and shrieking all the while. A sudden cold spell sent the grackles farther south. Gone were their teeming circles in the sky, their shrieking chatter, or their strange presence lined up and at the ready. She felt their absence acutely, the company they provided, the questions they raised inside her. Without them, the house narrowed, the husband and wife fighting all the time now. About food, about money, about her. "We should just take her back," he'd say. "Get a refund left on the contract before it's too late." The wife always said no. "Until I see milk oozing out of your teat, I ain't talking about it no more." And on it went, sometimes growing haggard and nasty between them, with blows flying in all directions. Dorcas did not look. She did not turn her head to see who swung and where such blows landed. She positioned her seat so it faced the window more than the room, and she kept her good eye focused outside. White people didn't like the help to see them in low moments. They never wanted to be reminded that what stood in the rear of the room, feeding the child, or waving the fly swatter, or refilling the glasses with water, could see and hear their moments of folly and shame. Soon, Dorcas found she could no longer mount the tunnel of distance she had been able to before. Now, the quarreling couple felt close at her back. The hungry babe lay on her chest, pawing and sucking and taking. She felt weak and lightheaded. And for the first time since her arrival, she produced less milk. There was a growing pain in her left breast, so she let Carol feed from the right and hoped that would be enough to send the child to sleep. It wasn't. Carol squirmed and howled and kicked. "Try the other one," said Lizzie. Dorcas shook her head. "I can't. It hurts." "Sure you can. It's going to hurt sometimes. That's no reason for Carol to go hungry." "She's had plenty." "Well, she wants more." Dorcas leaned over the manger and began to put the kicking child down. "Don't you put her down when she's screaming like that." Dorcas pulled the child back into her lap. She put the child on her left breast and winced when Carol latched on. But as she predicted, nothing came out, and Carol began howling again. "See?" Dorcas said. "I told you." "You're not even trying. Probably just a clog. You have to press out the milk then, like this," Lizzie said. She reached toward Dorcas's breast. Dorcas winced and blocked the woman's hand, her grip loosening on Carol just as the child wrenched backward. Carol fell to the floor with a loud thud. She lay still in a heap, not making a sound. Dorcas felt something crack inside her. The cloud in her eye seemed to break and seep outward at the sight of the stilled baby. Lizzie kneeled down and began looking Carol over. The girl opened her mouth and screamed. Lizzie took the baby in her arms. There, she murmured. "Go get Nan," she said, turning to Dorcas. But Dorcas could move. The seeping cloud made it all gray, hard to determine the boundaries of all the objects surrounding her, the origin of voices speaking. While Carol cried, another baby laughed. Another baby was gurgling, was giggling. "I'm sorry," Dorcas said to the room, to the gurgling baby. Lizzie sighed. "You should be. Now hold her. Carefully." Lizzie motioned for Dorcas to sit back in the chair, where she put the howling child back in Dorcas's arms. Carol grabbed hold of Dorcas's shoulder with her tiny fist, the pitch of her howl lowering then, petering out. "You're lucky she likes you so much," said Lizzie, walking out of the front door, leaving it open behind her. Dust swirled inside the sunlight, now filling the room. "I'm so sorry," Dorcas said to the child in her arms. In this new amber light, she could see her son's face so clearly. Adam. His small heart beating, a thick gurgling sound coming from his throat. There was his small body, no bigger than a head of cabbage, a bona fide call baby. With her, then gone, and now back again. Old women always said it was bad luck to go naming a child before their 9th day of life. She couldn't help it, though. She named him early, when he was still just a melon inside her. The suckling child they pushed into her arms 2 days after the burial was not Adam, and the pale, mewling child searching for her nipple now wasn't either. Somehow, they had swallowed him whole, and she couldn't locate him. The chasm between this world and the one her son lived in felt fixed and vast. No matter what she did, she couldn't cross it. And somewhere stuck between the two worlds lies her grief, a swelling balloon she couldn't reach. It remained a blur, a threatening specter outside her periphery, a piece of hard flint pressing upon the unseeing eye, until now, until the sight of the small, stilled body punctured the balloon, and its contents broke over her in one unforgiving wave. She shut her eyes tight and sucked in big gasps of thick, humid air. She jammed her breast in the child's mouth. She called on the warm, solid blankness to come over her, to restore the soft gray nothing she felt before. Come on, child. Suck down this grief. Take it all back. Chapter 12.